So many people are looking to live happier, more stress-free lives. We provide interviews from mental health experts across various fields because we know finding quality information isn't always easy. Let's find more sanity together.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Sanity Podcast. This is part of the ABCT Sanity collaboration. Today's topic is harms caused by misapplication of CBT. Our guests today, we have two guests. We have Dr. Ilana Seager van Dyk, a senior lecturer in clinical psychology at Massey University in Wellington, New Zealand. And thank you for recording a totally different time zone and distance away. Her research uses experimental and longitudinal methods to understand the social and emotional mechanisms underlying mental health disparities in populations under chronic stress, particularly LGBTQ plus people, during critical developmental transitions. As a clinical scientist, her goal is to translate these basic research findings into improved evidence-based clinical care for youth and their families. She has published 27 peer-reviewed journal articles and 2 book chapters, and she currently holds a 3-year grant from the Health Research Council of New Zealand to culturally adapt LGBTQ affirming CBT for New Zealand adolescents and their family. We have Dr. Alexandria Miller, who is a clinical psychologist and research fellow in the National Center for PTSD Women's Health Science Division and a clinical fellow in the Women's Trauma Recovery Team at the Boston VA, and is a teaching fellow in the Department of Psychiatry at Boston University. Her research interests lie in mental health equity for those who hold intersecting minoritized identities. She hopes to understand the strengths and struggles for minoritized groups, how these individuals relate to their own mental health, and adapting evidence-based treatment to better address their mental health needs. This work has been conducted with both veterans and civilians and has been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals. She recently co-edited a special issue of The Behavioral Therapist, both authors are here for this, focusing on ways therapeutic interventions can be misapplied and caused harm to minoritized populations and how mental health professionals can avoid those harms in their work. She regularly conducts workshops in the Boston area focused on mental health equity for minoritized populations and creating systemic change within the field of psychology. Both of you, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I just mentioned this special issue in The Behavior Therapist, which is a journal with ABCT, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. Tell us a bit about this issue and how it got going and what the goal of publishing it was.
Sure. Yeah. So this is an issue, as mentioned, that's about the misapplications of CBT and how it can cause harm to different populations. It kind of came out of a controversy or a raising awareness of the ways that behavior therapists in particular, but mental health providers in general, had contributed to the development of so-called conversion therapies that are used to invalidate, harm, and oppress sexual and gender minority folks. So that kind of raising awareness happened a few years ago, and from that, questions started to be raised about, well, what are the other things that we do as mental health providers that might be negatively impacting the people that we're hoping to help? For example, thinking about weight management. Is that doing, good things, or is it potentially harmful? Autism, other things like that. And so that was kind of the genesis of it.
When you think about therapy research, we're often thinking about doing things, creating things to help people. Do you think that as a field we're spending enough time looking at the other side of it, about how potentially some of the things that we are creating or the way we go about it is causing potential harms?
I feel like that's a really complicated question. The first thing that came to mind is this idea that although the interventions that we've developed really can be very helpful to some people, they are often developed with a very specific type of person in mind. And a lot of the research that we have currently, like a lot of the evidence that we have has really been focused on certain populations. Usually it's the people who are in the majority, not the people in the minority. So when we're thinking about how do we apply these strategies, sometimes we assume that the research that we have is good enough. And it often isn't. We often need more information about how these things really can be useful for people who have experienced, for example, like oppressive systems and how they exist in the world, and also things that are more culturally bound, things that are relevant to their communities, because inherently psychology is culturally bound. It's just that the culture that we're using is the majority culture. So how do we think a little bit differently about how we apply these strategies is something we don't think about a lot, but increasingly more, I think. And especially with this special issue, there are so many ways in which the authors who contributed are obviously thinking about this. So I personally feel like it's a direction our field is moving in.
How much research? So you were talking about one direction where we're taking what they did on a majority group and seeing how it works with minoritized groups. How much is going on the other way, where they're directly saying we're going to start from the minoritized group, and I mean maybe shift it up, maybe you don't. But I guess my point is, how much are you starting from that seed rather than the reverse way that you had just mentioned?
I can't think of many situations in which people start with the minoritized group. I mean, even within kind of minoritized research, we often find that the initial studies are done with the most privileged within that community and then just assumed to apply to people from different ethnicities or from different who hold other kind of minoritized identities as well. So lots more work to be done in that space, I think.
There are also some people who in the field who are doing specific types of research, like community-based participatory research, where you really are focusing on that like bottom-up kind of approach to research. I feel like it's becoming a little more well-known. And I don't want to dismiss that there are researchers who have been doing this work for a really, really long time. It's just, it feels a little bit separate from clinical psychology and from cognitive behavioral approaches in particular. I think CBT sometimes has a little bit of an echo chamber. And there's a lot of other people in the field of psychology more broadly who are doing this awesome work, pulling from even like social psych or developmental psych, who are doing this like really cool stuff. It's just, we need to crosstalk a little bit more, because some of the approaches could be really helpful. And I think communities are really wanting that. They want to be able to access these treatments that feel relevant to them and exciting and helpful. But we just don't have them yet.
And I think part of that, right, is because community engaged research and that bottom-up research can be a little messy sometimes, right? Like people, when we're working with folks who like haven't learned the scientific method, and you start with step 1 and you go through step 10 and you do not divert from that kind of that very rigid way of being, it can look a little bit different from quote unquote traditional science, and then it can be harder to present those things at conferences, get those things disseminated through kind of traditional academic routes, or it may be work that, because of the values of the community, they don't particularly care about those traditional academic routes. And so, again, I think, as Alexandria kind of said, it's about kind of bringing these different kind of bodies of work together and actually talking across different methodologies and different approaches to make sure that we're serving the communities that we all want to help in the best way.
And one other way, one more thought about that before we move on, is one other way that we tried to do this as we were doing this editing process is, one of the things that we emphasized is finding authors who held those identities that were writing about the identities that they hold. So it kind of was this idea that if we can involve the community in the research a little bit more, then hopefully it has a little bit of that effect where like we're pulling people in who have lived experience of these things. They're not talking from a researcher in like an ivory tower perspective, but like, hey, this is my life. And I'm bringing this perspective to help my own community, which I feel like is like a step towards that, where you're still using the expertise of trained researchers, but at the very least, they have very intimate connections with the community that they're writing about. And that takes a little bit of a different flavor, which is why in our beginning issue at the start, we have everyone's positionalities kind of listed in our intros, just to give some context to like who's talking right now, who is giving us this information, who did this amazing work, and why is it relevant for them.
Well, when like the research model of like science, like practitioner, was the idea that you're doing your clinical, you're getting ideas, you do the research to validate, invalidate, use that to inform clinical, and go in that cycle, right? What was the model? The I can't remember is it a Boulder model or the model that I'm talking about? Well, anyway, the scientist practitioner model. Somebody might be screaming, "No, wrong model," but that's okay. But it sounds very much like that traditional call when the pull for our field to be more scientific, what they were asking for. Like, use your clinical judgment experience in order to inform the research that you're doing, but make sure to do the research to back up what you think might be true rather than just basing it on what you think. So are you finding that you had made a comment that it doesn't seem like as welcome potentially if it's not following what the standard protocol is? How much pushback are we finding doing these alternative ways of researching because we might have to because it's more grassroots?
I can't speak to, I'm not the person who accepts conference submissions, or I'm not an editor, other than a guest editor of this lovely special issue, not an editor of a journal. I think in some ways it's more the kind of broader cultural things. I mean, I'm sure that there are kind of concrete metrics that we can point to that kind of speak to these types of science being less valued. An example I can think of in New Zealand is that kind of here, there is a kind of founding document of the country that was signed between the indigenous folks, the Māori, and the British settlers. And since, the founding of New Zealand, there's been an increased push to be a bicultural nation. And so a few years ago, there was this big kind of controversy where a bunch of mostly white academics from like the most elite institution in the country said, Indigenous knowledge isn't science, right? Like that's not... like you're just making stuff up, you're just talking with your friends, like this is not something that we should be funding, be like listening to as valid ways of knowing. And that rightly caused an uproar and kind of, different initiatives follows from that. But I think that kind of just speaks to this, like, what is knowledge, what is truth? And I think that's a broader discussion in society writ large at the moment due to various political forces. That I think impacts our science, impacts the way we do things. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but that's what it made me think of.
No, I mean, that's really interesting. So when you made this call to action where you asked people like, hey, can you write about this or talk about this? What type of reception did you get, and how were people feeling about the call to action?
Yeah, this was the most exciting part for me. I came onto this project a little bit later. Ilana asked me to join, and I remember thinking like, this is going to be great. And also I'm nervous about how people will respond because I think sometimes people have very strong reactions to a generalization of like, we need to move the field in a different direction. Like people can have really strong emotional reactions to that. And considering all the controversy that Ilana was talking about, there was a lot going on at ABCT at that time. And we got an amazing response, actually. We had so many people write in and we asked people to just give us a short little paragraph summary of what they might want to write about. And we had way more people indicate they were interested than we could possibly fit in 2 editions. And at one point we were having conversations about like, do we do a 3rd one? Like if all these pan out, what are we going to do with all the overflow? So that was really wonderful. And I think the breadth of identities that we were able to represent, like the amount of people who, like I was saying earlier, like the authorship teams had people with lived experience, like all of this information was really surprising and like really encouraging to me. I found it exciting and like, this is exactly where the field should be going. We should be doing this stuff all the time, hoping that, you know, this no longer becomes a special issue. This is like part of how research is done always, is all of these considerations happening in how we do all of our journals going forward. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it wasn't just like, you know, our young activisty type people writing in articles. It was really spanning all career stages. As Alexandria said, also a wide range of different presenting problems. So it was really cool to have a place for folks to kind of come together and think through these issues from their very kind of specific content areas. It was really cool.
You might not be able to answer this one, but because I don't know if it was written communication or verbal communication, but was there a sense of relief where people are like, thank you for asking? Like now we have like a platform.
Yeah. I can think of a few people who certainly once this was published, I saw them posting on social media their links to their articles, and they're like, you know, it's so exciting to have a place to put this kind of all of these things that we as a field have been thinking about, but don't necessarily make it to the general journals. And yeah, I don't know, Alexandria, did you ever thought about that one?
I would agree. It was mostly after like the first part came out that but I had a lot of people reach out, and I sent it around kind of my job and my local academic circles, and people's response was really like, wow, this is such an amazing resource. I can't believe like that I have such great access to this now, because it's just, I feel like the breadth that we have in the special issue is really unique too. There's just like a lot of communities represented. And so people were saying things like, I learned so much that I didn't know. Like, I'm really surprised that I've never read an article about this topic before. So in general, I think the feedback was really positive.
We keep talking about this amazing resource. How do people find this resource if they're going, well, where do I click to read all of these things that they're talking about?
The behavior therapist is online now, right? Fully online. So I think you can Google it. I'm actually not sure where it lives, but.
Is it only for members, or can the broad public get a hold?
No, I think it's public. Is that right, Ilana?
I cannot. I feel like we should have figured this out before we record. I don't know. But we can certainly find it. I'm sure that ABCT can get us a public link if one doesn't already exist to link to this.
Perfect. We can put that in the show notes and hopefully get access. So stay tuned. Stay tuned for that one. Okay. So what are, and this is a very broad question. What are the potential harms by implementing CBT incorrectly or uninformed or insensitively? I'm sure there's a lot of different words that we could throw in, like adjectives to put in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really, really big question. The first thing that comes to mind for me is, because this is actually work that I personally do, and most of my caseload often is people who hold one or more minoritized identities. That's like where I live. And I also identify as a CBT, like theoretical orientation is mostly CBT. So one of the things that I think about is the risk of further invalidating somebody who lives in a system that has continually told them that they don't belong there. And there's like big existential reasons why you would not want to do that, but also just very basic ones. Like, we want people to come back, right? Like, therapy is a space where you want people to be able to trust you. You rely a lot on alliance building, and you use that alliance to really carry people forward in meeting their treatment goals. And if you can't create that relationship because you've like fundamentally invalidated their existence, or like something that's very important to them, like Lana was alluding to earlier, like, my spiritual practice is part of my cultural background and it's my knowledge, and I'm bringing that to you because it's important to me in this room. And then you're kind of like, but we're just challenging your thoughts. Like, that's not part of this. Like that's probably very invalidating. It can really like increase the likelihood that people will have stigma against seeking help in the future and they won't come back. And I think that's like the big one that I'm always kind of like, we want these people to feel like they can access care. And if they're being told that they don't belong there, or that's not what we work on here, then they're probably not going to want to be there.
Yeah, and we can also, you know, through the misapplication of specific skills, like actively lead clients into harm's way, right? If you, I mean, my work is with LGBT clients primarily, but if we think about, you know, if a client is worried about coming out to their parent, or worried about expressing their gender more freely at school, and we kind of blindly follow CBT kind of skills, and we say, oh, well, that's, you know, that seems unreasonable. Let's restructure that thought, when actually maybe there's truth to that thought. Maybe it is unsafe for that kid to come out to their parent, for them to express their gender at school. Then we could be leading folks into like very visceral harm, right? We have really high rates of LGBTQ kids being kicked out of home and being rejected by their family. We should not have any part in that as therapists, right? We should not be contributing to that problem. Similarly, I mean, we have the recent case in Oklahoma, right, of a trans kid being bullied at school and ending up dying. We don't want to do things that could potentially put our clients in harm's way, and we have a lot of power. So we need to think about how we use that most effectively to affirm, uplift, and, you know, move our clients towards wellness.
Yeah, and I think another like example of that in a different space is in the trauma space, which is mostly where I live. And we do a lot of like exposure-based stuff. Like, I'm going to send you out into your community. I'm going to ask you to do things that make you feel really afraid. And I'm going to ask you to like stick with it. And that theoretically is great, and it's usually really helpful and it works really well. But if we don't ask a lot of questions, and if we're not very curious about the environments that in which we're sending our clients, then we could do exactly what Ilana's saying, is send them to a place where they could objectively be in danger. It's not safe outside in the US or in New Zealand for certain groups of people who are minoritized. They could actively be harmed by our intervention. So there's a lot of like mostly behavioral stuff. Like, if you're asking somebody to do something where there's a chance that other people will harm them, like, that's a very serious, thoughtful conversation you need to have with them to make sure that you're not pushing them into something that could make it worse.
So a major component here sounds like doing a thorough assessment to understand the situation before putting an intervention, or really questioning, can this cause a problem for this person given their particular context? Mm-hmm. And the thing that popped into my head is like different cultures have different parenting structure. Like, you know, like versus like how much seniority your elders have, how much you go in line and you listen, versus you have more freedom. And I'm not sure why this is an example that I think because this had come up recently for me. And somebody might give a recommendation of, oh, you should hold your boundaries, you should do this, you should do that, but it's a major cultural violation for them. And now it could cause more harm than good by doing that. Where when you don't take it from that perspective and you just take it from your perspective, you're like, well, what's the problem with doing that?
Absolutely. Definitely. I totally agree. And I think that environmental piece is so important. I mean, we've spoken to specific ways in which not really doing a thorough assessment could lead people to harm. But I think there's something also to be said just for being very well-informed therapists in society. And what I mean by that is a couple of the authors in this special issue kind of spoke to kind of structural forms of oppression and how invalidating and like incorrect it is for us as CBT therapists to kind of attribute issues or problems to like individual factors, when of course a person is experiencing distress when they live in a world where they can't safely walk down the street, or where they can't they can't go to school and share their pronouns or whatever that may be. And so really, not only just doing a thorough assessment of the individual, but like taking into account the kind of more structural factors at play, and not blaming individuals for structural problems, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a related conversation here about, I think in our field, at least we used to, I'm not sure if most people exist here now, but we used to have this kind of pervasive idea that the therapist could come into the room and be like acultural, apolitical, like come in without any agenda and just exist as like a blank slate for the client to kind of lay their problems on, and then you do your like internal magic and then tell them how to fix it. And I just feel like that is really not correct, and it's also not helpful, right? Like if we're not recognizing that we have our own messaging, our own internalized biases, our own culture that we're bringing into the room, then we can't even do enough self-reflection to understand when we might be missing the things that Ilana is talking about. Like, I think this work takes a lot of time and effort and like internal self-reflection, and is also why it's so challenging, because you also will never know everything about every culture. Like that's not really possible. I mean, I guess maybe if you tried really, really hard for like a lifetime, but you have to be able to just sit with the fact that you're not going to know everything. So like, how do you show up with somebody, recognize where your strengths and weaknesses are, do the work to learn enough about that person's culture, and be open to changing your approach based on what they need? It takes a lot of like humility to show up in that way with every single client all the time.
Thinking about like, and you actually segued directly into the question I had about when you consider yourself culturally competent enough to be taking on a case, because in my mind, as you were talking, I also had a fear here where people say, well, I shouldn't take on any of these cases because I'm not culturally competent. And now you have this whole swath of the community not willing to treat a group. And now there's decreased access to care because you're saying I'm just not going to do it. So like, I think you sort of defined cultural competence there, but how should people be thinking about this, taking on clients, and when they should consider referring out versus working with the awareness that they have?
I'm curious to hear what Alex. Oh, you go.
Yeah. Before, I just want to reframe the cultural competence quickly. I actually don't use that phrase very often, just because I feel like it assumes that it's like a goal that you can check off. You're like, oh, I did the thing. I read the TBT special issue, so I am now qualified, or whatever, I would reframe it maybe more as like cultural responsivity. And that also feels more aligned with this idea of like lifelong learning. Like you're never going to know everything, but the goal is for you to continually be meeting your clients where they are, learning more about what they need and their cultural background. And I will say too, this very broadly applies to everybody. Like everybody has identities that need to be attended to. So this actually isn't just a minoritized client problem. Like there might be some therapists who are really nervous about taking on certain clients' identities, but in reality, you should be doing this work with everybody anyway. So these same types of skills that you're already using for somebody who seems like they might hold a lot of majority identities might also be relevant for the people that you're working with minoritized identities. It doesn't necessarily just apply for people who are very obviously minoritized. Yeah, that's what we're all stop in case you have something to say, Ilana.
No, I 100% agree with everything that you just said, Alexandria. And I think of like cultural responsivity as like like a mindset in some ways, more than having all of the concrete content knowledge, if that makes sense. Like, I think if you are, as our kind of code of ethics and best practice guidelines would encourage us to be, a reflective practitioner who is able to reflect on their biases and their positionalities, it shouldn't really matter what the culture or the particular identities are of a client that comes in to the room, because you already have kind of interrogated for yourself kind of the different kind of power that you hold in the room and that you hold in society, and you can apply that kind of flexibly. Obviously, you should also build content knowledge. You should learn about different cultures and relevant practices. Like here in New Zealand, as mentioned, Indigenous populations are really important. I have learned how to speak some Indigenous language in order to open sessions in a culturally responsive way. It took me 2 hours to learn that. That's not that hard, right? Like, this is something that's like really important and goes a long way. I also, I just want to, highlight that again, in our code of ethics, there is, a section around social justice. It is our responsibility as clinical psychologists and as other types of mental health practitioners for their various professional bodies not to turn away minoritized clients because of their minoritized identities, right? If you feel unprepared to work with that client, get cultural supervision, right? You can still, unless you feel that you will truly do active harm to the client, potentially because you hold, harmful biases. For example, if you don't believe trans people should exist, don't take on a trans client. But then the next step should be to interrogate that bias you hold, seek your own supervision for that, and try and work through it, because it's our responsibility to serve all people who need it.
And one way that you could start doing this work, if you do feel really uncomfortable, maybe you don't start in the therapy room. Like, maybe that's just not where you start. Maybe you start by getting involved outside in your personal life. You start volunteering with certain organizations that mirror the makeup of your city, or you start getting involved specifically if you're I really just don't know a lot about queer folks and I need more exposure to that. Join an organization that is trying to help the move queer rights forward. There are things that you can do that maybe are a little bit outside of your job that could help you to develop some humility, some confidence, some, however you want to phrase it, comfort. And then you can use the things you learn in the therapy room, because we're not just psychologists, we're also human beings, and the things that we apply in our life often also bleed into our practice, whether we really want it to or not. So if you're looking to become a more well-rounded, culturally responsive therapist, it might mean that your whole life also could use some rounding out.
How do you think as a field we could do better with people being able to get culturally responsive consultation like you were do you think it's readily available, that it's easy to find? And if not, this might be pie in the sky. What would you want to see going on and moving forward?
So one of your questions is, do you think it's readily available? And my answer is yes and no. Yes, because some people are doing an amazing job doing this work specifically. There are a lot of scholars in our field who have invested a significant amount of time and effort to making these types of resources to have culturally responsive content, especially workshops and trainings and all of that. And the statistics for how many, percentage-wise, the number of psychologists who hold minoritized identities, very, very low, very low. So finding a one-on-one type of supervision, I think, is probably going to be much more challenging. And there's a lot of resources. ABCT has a bunch of resources for that. They have partnerships with Bear Mental Health and Wellness. They're doing a ton of this work too. I think they are, and YouTube, I feel has a lot of these. And we also have scholars in other fields, right? We're clinical psychologists, but if you're looking for like cultural supervision in a more broad way. The field of social psychology has really amazing scholars doing this work, development. I mean, like we have so many other avenues that we sometimes forget about how to find these resources. So that's my yes and no. I wish there was more, but that's where I feel like we are. What do you think, Ilana?
No, I completely agree. And I think that the way to increase that needs to be at a system level. Sorry to keep giving New Zealand as an example, but here our psych board has made it a requirement, like to register as a psychologist, you have to be able to work with Māori, with the Indigenous folks. And so because the board requires that, my institution pays for me to have cultural supervision as needed, right? Because it's a requirement of being licensed in this country. I think that we need, the APA, the code of ethics, we need state licensing boards to say, no, this actually is really important, because then after that, hopefully the kind of infrastructure can be built in terms of more funding for cultural supervisors, a higher valuing of folks' time. I think that's something that Alexandria and I have both experienced, as she's a current, but I'm a former SIG leader, special interest group leader of a minoritized SIG. Lots of requested labor for free, right? Like, oh, can you help me out with this, culture thing for free? We need structures that like pay people for their time and for their expertise, and not treat this kind of cultural supervision as just kind of an add-on. Before getting to like state board level, I think that like professional organizations like ABCT could go some way to developing these sorts of resources. ADAA, APA, other acronyms, could, seek funding potentially for some sort of, resource where any members can go there with kind of cultural questions and like pay people for their time. I mean, ABCT alone, we have huge SIGs, a huge number of SIGs that cover a wide range of different minoritized identities. And the people in these groups are like experts in their field. They developed the, LGBT affirmative CBT. They developed the manuals for these things. And so it seems like a lost opportunity to have all of this knowledge there, but not have a structure for other practitioners who aren't experts in those areas to kind of benefit from it.
And just talking about resource, I know you said ABCT has some resource here. Did you, and if not, we could probably get the link for it, but is it pointed somewhere where there is like this repository where people, is it just part of the CE channels? Do they have SIG websites or something like that for people that want to tap in?
I think that's the issue, right? Is that we don't have a good systematic way of sharing resources like that. I think ABCT does have some fact sheets. I know that our SIG helped contribute to some fact sheets on LGBT folks, for example. But I think my point is that the special interest groups of people exist, and those people all have expertise and bring those expertise to the convention and do CE sessions and all of that sort of thing. But we don't have like we don't have a kind of centralized way of disseminating that. You have to join the SIG, or you have to like go to all the sessions, flip through, or I guess swipe through the convention program and find those sessions and go to them. What do you think, Alexandria?
There is a web page with all of the SIG's leaders' information. You could join a SIG. I know this feels like surprising to a lot of people, but you actually can join a SIG even if you don't hold that identity. So if you want to learn more and you're kind of like, this is something I need more training on, you could join that SIG. And in fact, having more people who hold majority identities, who can help like move, who have like relatively more power, can help move the cause forward is actually very helpful to minoritized SIGs, as long as you're there just to like help aid them in their journey. I think like that actually would be really helpful to a lot of people, and might be another way, like to my previous point, that you could not only learn some stuff, but also help be like a psychologist activist type role. So you can get in contact with any of the SIG leaders. The websites and the emails are on the website, and a lot of SIGs also have their own websites that you can learn more about them through that.
That systemic model that you were talking about, I was thinking about my license in Connecticut. They require like an hour of a veteran focused CE every so often. And so I will take that and it has me doing training around that. And I see what you're saying where we're not seeing that I haven't seen that except for with veterans personally. I mean, not New Zealand. In New Zealand, it sounds like it's different. I'm talking about in in the States and in New York and in this area. But any other systemic measures that, like, I thought that was a really like great idea. Like any other systemic measures that you could think of that we as a field could be doing better? Because one of them, we're pulling back from the beginning of the episode, but what are we considering research that we're willing to take on? That's a systemic. Providing more emphasis and access to resources to learn more about cultures and get support, and then maybe having requirements in a way which promote the idea to get people. Sometimes you need a requirement to get people ticking in the right direction, even if it's not a super hard requirement. Any other major systemic implementations that are talked about?
I think there are two that are in more of an academia world, which a lot of people in ABCT are in this world. There's the kind of pipeline issue of how do we create more opportunities for more diverse psychologists to come into the field. And there's a huge conversation people are having about that. People have varying opinions about like what would be best. I think the key is that before you can bring people into the field who hold minoritized identities, you need to make sure that the place where you're asking them to be is not going to harm them. So if the structure that you've created is not actively like anti-oppressive, then you don't want to bring these people into that environment. So change the culture, fix the pipeline on the like beginning end. And then on the other end, for people who are maybe already PIs, I think there's a lot we can do better about how we recruit participants for our studies, and how we then, once we have participants, how we measure things like demographic information. Like we really just kind of do that really willy-nilly. We just kind of like decide how to ask the questions instead of thinking very deeply about like, why are we assigning certain labels to certain groups? How do we assess this information? What's the consequence of assessing it in this particular way? And what does that mean for the interventions that we're going to develop from these people's involvement? Like, what does that mean for who this can actually apply to? I think there's a lot that we can do in the research realm to help create interventions that are just a little more responsive to the people we're trying to serve.
I completely agree with that, and I was going to bring up the pipeline issue as well, so I appreciate you bringing that up, Alexandria. I was also thinking about, in terms of the other end of the process for folks who've been in the field for a long time, I think, it's important for us as practitioners to reflect for ourselves on our own positionalities and biases, but I think we also need to think about the way that our field is set up, and how it privileges some voices over others, and how some groups kind of have this consolidated power that is maintained for decades and decades that make all of these other changes we're talking about really hard to bring about. I mean, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the behavior therapy apology for conversion therapies, but just the amount of push. I was really shocked with all of that, with the huge pushback from folks who'd been in the field and who'd been past presidents of ABCT and had held these positions of power for things as simple as apologizing for contributing to some of these harmful practices. So I think, and I think, we could unpack why that may be, but I think it's just really important for us to think about, like, how do we elect presidents of our professional organizations? Who are in the room? Who are making the decisions? And do they reflect the values that we want the field to have moving forward. Because I think in some ways it's somewhat of an existential question for our field that I think, I mean, both me and Alexandria obviously love clinical psychology, love the work that we do, are passionate and involved in organizations like ABCT for working towards kind of minoritized folks' liberation and wellness. But like, there's only so long we can do this for, right? Like, if the systems don't change, people are just going to go elsewhere, right? People are not going to be members of these big organizations if they don't see their values, including their values for diversity and inclusion, reflected in these spaces. And so I think it is not just a nice to have, but like an urgent must address issue, like urgently. Yeah.
If someone is listening and saying, well, what would that look like, it being reflected? And I know we're talking about ABCT because that's the how we got connected here. But I mean, this goes outside of ABCT to different systems, different organizations. What would a successful implementation look like if this was actually being reflected in change?
I have thoughts. Do you have thoughts?
I do. You go first.
Okay. I think it would look like, how would we know this is a good therapy question? What would a successful end of the intervention look like? I think it would look like minoritized folks going into these spaces and feeling like, yeah, this is a place I fit, right? This, I want to be here, right? And that could be for anything, right? That can be in your clinical practice, that can be at your university, that can be at ABCT or a professional organization. And probably, I mean, I don't want to dictate for everybody what that might look like, but for me, that would look like there being dedicated positions, paid positions on the board, in the like central office that address issues of diversity. It would look like everybody having trainings that highlight those values and teach them concrete skills to make sure that they're being respectful, affirming, and uplifting minoritized folks. I think, that those are broad, but Alexandria, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, that's very similar to what I was thinking. And I'll add that when I feel most comfortable in the space where I haven't been before is when I walk into it as like a new person experiencing this new space, and I look around and I see people who don't look like me, but do look like me. Like there's like a lot of variety, right? Like I can look around and be like, wow, like there's so many different types of people who are sharing the same space, and they all seem comfortable sharing this same space together. And I think that's really difficult. And it actually is like, it's interesting that in the US, we seem to be like quite far behind where your like New Zealand psychological community is, because we say in the US that we really value this idea of like a melting pot where people come, they find their home here. There's like this idea of like the American dream. And I don't know how much that is actually reflected in a lot of these organizations, that their primary job, or like one of their big values at least, is like helping people. It's like you would think that people in helping fields would want a lot more people to feel like very comfortable and accepted and welcomed. And that's not always the impression that I get from coming into spaces like this. So I think for me, if I walked into a space and I was like, wow, I can see so many different people represented, there are trainings, I'll look at all these different research ideas that are with all these different types of groups, like in a program, which I think ABCT is doing much better over the last like 5-10 years. And I think like people would feel better, and that would be like the end goal. It's just, you would feel comfortable. And I think before we get there, before people feel comfortable, a lot of people are going to feel uncomfortable, because it requires the people who've had a lot of power for a long period of time to give up a little bit of that so that other people can then like rise. And that feels very uncomfortable. Like I can't remember the saying exactly, but it's something like, if you're used to having privilege, like equality feels like oppression or something like that. And I think that's generally true. Like, it requires a lot of like reevaluating who you are, how you show up in spaces before it can actually equal equality, or really what we're going for, to Ilana's point earlier, is like liberation for these groups.
And I think that, I mean, both Alexandria and I are part of this ABCT program called the Change Leaders Program, which I think is one nice example of like steps towards this kind of better vision for an organization. The goal of the program, for folks who don't know, is basically they selected 10 mostly all early career folks with diverse backgrounds and diverse interests. And we are kind of tasked with both learning about just leadership and kind of demystifying what an organization like ABCT is and how it functions. Like, what does a board meeting do? What do the finances look like? All of that sort of thing. But we're kind of tasked with also coming up with a project that will help advance kind of diversity and inclusion in the organization. And those projects have looked really diverse in a bunch of different ways, right? Like, I'm working on this editorial fellowships idea where, like, how could we get more diverse people onto our journals and involved in the editorial process? There are some cool initiatives that all of this is still in progress, so we'll see how it works. But looking at how do we give back to the communities in the host cities of the conferences that we go to? Like, are there ways we could get involved with the communities there? So really I think these sorts of programs are really cool because they try to kind of even out the power dynamic a little bit. It's not, oh, you young people, you're just, causing a fuss. This is how we always do it. But no, you have valid ideas. Let's see what we can do to make this organization for us all, and not just for me and my friends,
So Ilana, you're at university. How do you feel? So we talk about like organization, and we're talking a lot about like almost past graduation. So looking down further, because often putting things at the roots, right? And when people are first entering the field is going to pass along with them, and it makes a lot of change. How do you, and I know you're only at one university and you can't speak for all universities, but how do you think implementation is happening at the training level through, internship, postdoc?
Yeah, in implementation of like more diversity and inclusion initiatives, you mean, or
that cultural sensitivity, how to work this into therapy, just all of it.
Yeah, I think it looks really different at every university, and obviously, I went to university in the States as well, so I have some sense of how things have been going there. I think it's really important for people involved in training to it's important for everybody to think about these things, but it's even more important for people in training to think about, potential harms to both trainees and their eventual clients and how we might mitigate that, because we have a huge responsibility, right, of like shaping these clinicians who then like go off and can do whatever they want. I think some ways that we do that at the university where I'm based is we're really interested in this pipeline issue and how to train a more diverse workforce. And so we have policies where we interview all Indigenous applicants, unless there's a very strong reason not to. That doesn't mean that we let everybody into the program, but the idea is that it's worth it for us to spend a few more hours interviewing folks that we can then give guidance on how to have a more successful application the following year. It's worth it for us to make sure that we are supporting the development of diverse scholars and clinicians. I think introducing these ideas early in training as well. So my particular area of expertise is in the LGBTQ space. And so I'm slowly inserting myself into all sorts of different classes that trainees might take to demonstrate, like, this isn't just like diversity class that you need to diversity day is here. This is when we like kind of pretend to care about these things. No, this is inherent to all of the work that we do as clinical psychologists and as mental health practitioners, and it's relevant to assessment, to treatment, to those micro skills micro counseling skills. It's important to Psych 101 and abnormal psych. like throughout the entire training process, I think it's important for these issues to be raised, not as like a novelty, but as inherent to the field and to this work. Yeah, I don't know if that fully answered your question, but.
Alexandria, do you have any thoughts or comments on the training side of things?
Well, yes. I guess with the big caveat that I probably should have said at the beginning is, since I work at the VA, like none of my comments on this panel reflect the opinions of the VA, that whole thing. And I actually think that VA Boston is doing a really great job with their internship training program. Like, I think like any institution, that's where I went for internship as well. There's some work to be done. And I just graduated from Suffolk University, which is also in Boston. And at both places, I saw some really amazing work regarding DEI initiatives. And I think the thing that stands out the most is when training programs are focused on creating like very specific changes over time. So I think Ilana's example of like, we're only going to interview Indigenous interviewees, like, great. Like, that's a very tangible, specific goal that you can do. And you can do it every year. You can expand the program. You can work on it and refine it if you need to. There was a lot of work at Suffolk for getting more diverse syllabi, kind of like what you were talking about, like making sure that this diversity content is integrated throughout the coursework. So many different committees, like DEI committees. I think the only thing with the DEI committees is you just have to make sure that it's not just you meeting and talking. It's like actually create some actionable, like tangible changes for the people involved. I think one area though that a lot of training programs can have in common, and it could be really tangible, is money, frankly. If there are students at your institutions who are going to hold minoritized identities, or they're going to be like first-gen students, they're probably going to need a little more like of a leg up for like various reasons. Like, there's a lot of reasons why minoritized trainees might need some like assistance, either like tangible money or literally like, here's a scholarship for going to conferences. Here's how you write for these journals, and we'll give you some extra time in your schedule to like learn the skills maybe that you didn't learn. Like, if you don't come from a family who was in academia, there might be some things literally about just the culture of academia that you don't know. So all of this effort on the back end for minoritized trainees can sometimes take like it's just more effortful than other students. And so money is a really tangible way that you can support them. So at Suffolk, I was the founder of the Graduate Students of Color Collaborative. And basically the point of that organization is we all came together, we would meet, we had mentors who would like help us move through the program. I kind of served as like also a space where we could commiserate if we needed to. And also we got funding. So we got funding to go to an extra conference every year. And that meant that we got to build our CVs a little bit more, because we started from like nothing. And we were like, we need more effort. We need more time. We need more support. And they were willing to meet us where we, like, all the things that we had asked for, we got. And I think like when students ask you what they need, try to give it to them, because it's when you can actually like respond in a tangible way, it shows that you are actually invested. I think it's similar to this change leader program. Like, they could have said, oh, well, we want to do this, and then never actually do it, but they actually did it. And I feel like when you can show that you've done something, it reflects your values. The behaviorist in all of us, I think, is asking, what are the things that you did that show me what you believe in and where your values are. So
I think often when people think about putting money behind something, they think a lot of money, and they're thinking about like big donations. But like my grad program pings the alumni to help people afford going on internship, like the move. So people aren't geographically, why can't I say the word? Geographically, thank you. I was like, I'm going to switch gears and say a different word. Geographically stuck, so people could go to the internship that best fits them, and they take donations, and that can be anywhere from $50 to a couple $100, and you really
Yeah.
help someone. So
That
if
actually
you're listening,
exists.
yeah,
Still, that exists. There's every year, I feel like I see there's a grassroots organization, like, or grassroots community who is putting together a fund for BIPOC trainees. I think it's specifically BIPOC trainees who are going on internship and need money to relocate or need money for furniture. And you can just donate money to these trainees, and then they dole it out equally depending on how many people apply. And that's like a really small way you can make a pretty big difference for somebody.
yeah. So everybody can get involved. You don't have to be at the high up level figuring out where funds are going in order to help monetarily for people. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other ways that people can contribute in smaller levels. Before we sign off, any last comments or thoughts about our topic today that we didn't cover that's burning that you feel like we should have our listeners know about?
I just wanted to encourage folks to read the special issues. So we'll put the link in the show notes, but just as a little preview, some of the topics that it covers across the two different issues include, potential harms from emphasizing individual factors over structural factors, like we talked about, the history of clinical psychology and its relationship to ableism, ways to, in an evidence-based way, de-implement harmful practices like so-called conversion therapies for LGBTQ folks, the unintentional harms of weight management programs, how we can use CBT to think about anti-trans legislation, which is obviously widespread in the US at the moment, how to liberate CBT from kind of white Western European culture, harms and psychological interventions for folks with psychosis. I wrote an article, which obviously I think is very good, on asexuality and how the DSM kind of and our field continues to pathologize asexual people. There's an article about Latinx immigrants, about culturally responsive CBT with folks with chronic fatigue. And then there are a couple of really interesting kind of commentary articles about like scientific retractions of journal articles and how we can be more socially responsible when doing so, and zoomed in kind of commentary on the conversion therapy controversy that we've alluded to a few times today. So lots of different interesting topics. I highly recommend you check it out.
I have no burning thoughts about the issue. I will say, though, there are some really amazing organizations. If you're thinking to yourself still, like, okay, but how do I get involved? There's one called Project Short. It's typically for students to help peer mentor other minoritized students who want to get into graduate programs, so for the pipeline. But if you're a PI, you could help support your students in their participation in that program. And then for programs, academic programs, there's the Bridge Network, which is a kind of DEI collective that connects academic institutions nationwide who are doing these really amazing diversity initiatives, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you're kind of like, where do I start in my program, you can contact them and they can connect you with other programs who are already doing the work, so you can kind of share the load and in the service of resource sharing.
That's great. Well, thank you both for coming on and sharing your time to talk about such a pertinent issue. I learned a lot. I'm sure the people that are listening have learned a ton as well. We'll have some links to these resources into the show notes if you're interested. But thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.